at you this time with a discussion on 4.6, which is all about the different challenges to power in the area. Sorry, no, the era. I think it's just best to really kind of go through these and kind of just talk about them really quickly. There's nothing more here than just kind of a list of the different ways that we see power challenged during this time period, and they're broken up into internal and external. And it's best to kind of just list them by country, it seems like. In France, they talk about the Fronde, which is an internal rebellion. It is a internal rebellion against the powers of the king. We see... So this is right after the 30 Years' War, and to pay for the 30 Years' War, the King Louis XIV wants to raise taxes. And there's a couple of groups who are really upset with this. The first of those groups would be what's called the Paris Parlement, which is a parlement in France, even though this is where the origin of the term is. The Parlement in France is different from the Parlement in the Parliament in England. The Parlement are kind of like local courts. And so the Paris Parlement was one of the few checks of power that could happen against the king, and the king was basically steamrolling them. So the Paris Parlement first kind of declares war against the king and the Fronde immediately after the 30 Years' War. And then that gets quelled pretty quickly. And then what are called the sword nobility, which is basically the long-standing nobility in France, right? The nobility we think about with the land, and they're obviously warrior veterans. They also declare war against the king because they're losing their powers, and they lose as well, right? So yeah, that's the one French internal problem of this particular era, but don't worry, they have a lot more coming. In Portugal, we have a couple of external issues, right? So the Dutch and the English pushed them out of the Indian Ocean. Right, they are pretty much gone from Indian Ocean trade. But the other one we have is in Africa, led by Queen Nzinga. Queen Nzinga is the queen of an area of a state, the state of Ndongo, which is just south of the Kingdom of Congo, present-day Angola. Right, so there were slave raids going on against the Ndongo by the Portuguese, but then on top of that, there are African states attacking the state of Ndongo. Right, so she's under pressure, and so to kind of protect herself, she allies with Portugal, but that kind of turns pretty bad pretty quickly. She gets baptized, right? But the alliance breaks down. And so when that happens, she moves west and takes over the state of Matamba. And when she does that, she then counter revolts against her own state, her old state. She creates a rebellion in Ndongo against the people who took power from her, which is mostly the Portuguese, right? And then also at this time, she goes ahead and allies with the Dutch, who have already given the Portuguese problems in the Indian Ocean, and then offers runaway slaves freedom in Matamba. Excuse me. And so she ends up ruling Matamba and Ndongo for decades, builds a very economically strong state. So this is a rebellion against Portugal in West Africa that's successful for the most part. But once Queen Nzinga dies, that success is kind of reversed. The Dutch and English and Queen Nzinga are both examples of external pressures on the Portuguese Empire. Okay. Russia is all internal. Okay. So Russia's big issue is the serfs. So serfdom has been abolished in most of Europe. In fact, it's abolished pretty much everywhere, or at least for our purposes, everywhere, but the Russian Empire. Right, and there's a reason for that. The reason being that the the czars of Russia basically trade the peasants, the serfs, to the nobles for more power, right? Um, so we have a series of wars in Russia during the 14th and 15th century. So this is, right post Mongols, right? We see an increase in the power of nobility, right? So we just see the serfdom continue on in Russia. They talk about heavy tribute and taxes that force them into serfdom, right? Um, right. So the serfs benefit the governments quite a bit, right? It's beneficial for them to keep them in this situation. It regulates the peasants under the control of the nobility, right? And it also provided free labor, right? So these serfs are essentially slaves, and so they keep expanding it as they expand Russia, right? Um, the other thing that also keeps the serfs down are the mirs, which are these agricultural communes, right? That even when not so, these agricultural communes are not controlled by a noble, by a boyar, but nevertheless, they still control the small landholders amongst the peasants, right? By keep creating these communes that kind of keep them organized in that way, right? And they kind of show you just how much serfdom goes, right? The English freed their last serfs in 1574. We will not see the freedom of the serfs in Russia until the 1880s, or excuse me, 1860s, right? So it's a long, long time. 1861, I believe, right? So let's talk about our rebellions. So we have the Cossacks, the Cossack rebellions. So the Cossacks are so they live in the southern portion of Russia, on the steppes near the Black Sea, and they are sometimes even themselves Mongols, but they're heavily influenced by the Mongols of the region. They're influenced by Mongols, and a lot of times they are even runaway serfs. Okay. And they would a lot of times be very much they would consistently rebel against the central government, but for the most part they were kind of kept in check by the central government, and the central government would pay them to fight in the wars for them. However, we do have a Cossack slash peasant rebellion led by Yemelian Pugachev. What happened there? The Pugachev rebellion. So Pugachev is a Cossack peasant who begins a rebellion against Catherine the Great. Rebels against Catherine. This is actually outside of this era. I'm surprised we're talking about it, but that's fine. For giving the nobility even more power over the serfs. Right. What we see here is that like the Russian czars basically don't want to have to administer the peasants and serfs. They don't want to deal with that, and so they give that to the nobles in exchange for more central power in a lot of different ways, right? And so they give the nobles more power in exchange for loyalty to the czar. Right. So again, kind of going with whatever they want to do, especially internationally, right? And so he rebels. He claims to be Catherine's murdered husband, right? And so they control a lot of area between the Volga River and the Ural Mountains, but it obviously fails, right? And the rebellion just increases the suppression of the peasants at the hands of Catherine, which is ironic because Catherine kind of came into her rule wanting to help the peasants. In India, so yeah, we would also call these internal problems, right? These are both internal, not external. In India, we see the collapse of the Mughals at the hands of the Hindu Maratha warriors. The Hindu Maratha warriors who create the Maratha Empire. which basically ends the Mughal rule. The Maratha Empire will only be in charge of part of India until the British take it over. All right. Okay, so that's about it in India. That's an internal issue. All right. In Spain, in the Spanish Empire, we have the Pueblo Revolt, where the combined Pueblo and Navajo people, Apache, the Pueblo and Apache people of what is modern day New Mexico, revolt against Spanish power. So the Pueblo and Apache fight the colonizers trying to force conversion. Okay, and they will actually successfully take it over for about a dozen years before the Spanish come back in and reconquer the area that is modern day New Mexico. I believe we would consider this internal. All right, this is an internal issue within the empire, but let me see what they say. Yeah, it's internal to the colonies, right? Okay. All right. So then we kind of talk about the English colonies in general, which we got a lot going on here. We have the Maroon Wars in the Caribbean. So Maroons are descendants of runaway slaves. In fact, they themselves are oftentimes runaway slaves. And they started to form their own independent settlements, right? Which, by the way, I know we haven't talked about, but England colonizes Spanish colonies, and they take over the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and colonize most of the Caribbean themselves, right? And they are united on Jamaica in particular, the island of Jamaica, by who's called Queen Nanny. Right. They don't necessarily, they're not successful, right? But they fight to gain freedom, right? We see a lot of slave revolts in the American colonies, especially in the British colonies. The one they bring up in the United States colonies, the American colonies, is Gloucester County Rebellion. Okay, the Gloucester County Rebellion in Virginia in 1663, which is a mix of indentured servants and slaves, but it gets pushed out. It gets taken over pretty quickly. The big war, though, in the American colonies is the Metacom's War. Okay, so the Metacom's War is the final effort of the indigenous people to drive the British out of New England, right? We see, but the end point of this is the subjugation of the Wampanoag people. Oops. The Wampanoag people at the hands of the British. Okay, so these are all, internal to the colonies, but within England itself, we have a very famous event, the Glorious Revolution. So this is right after the English Civil War. The English Civil War was fought between the Parliament's supporters and the supporters of the king. There's also a religious battle where the king was Catholic and the Protestant Puritan. He was Anglican, and the Protestant Puritans were in charge of Parliament, or like one of the major groups of Parliament. And so it's a civil war that's both religious and political. Ending with the execution of Charles I, and then they install his brother, I believe it's his brother, James II as king. But James is Catholic, and then James creates kind of this these anti-Protestant policies, and it really angers a mostly Protestant society, right? So James II creates a lot of anti-Protestant policies, which greatly angers, the Protestants, right? And so a group of nobles, right, invite William of Orange of Netherlands William of Orange is invited to take power from James, invited to conquer England, basically saying that the nobles will help him out. They'll support him with soldiers if he comes in and conquers England. James flees, and both William and his daughter, Mary, take power in England. They take power, and this is called the Glorious Revolution because it's bloodless, right? It's a massive change in the society, right? This is a massive shift towards creates a kind of more parliament-led society, creates a parliament-led government rather than a king-led government. Not to say the king and queen weren't powerful; they still were very, very powerful. But this greatly strengthens the power of parliament in England. Okay, that's going to do it for this section. Lots of changes going on within these different societies, right? We see three kind of internal. It's all internal here, right? Internal for England. We see a lot of different conflicts arising during this time period. Frankly, nothing compared to what we're going to see 1750 to 1900. But we'll get there when we get there. And speaking of, I will see you